You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. One of the most critical regions in Europe today is the Balkans, most especially the countries of the former Yugoslavia. While Western attitudes towards the area are often negative, minus those lovely holiday destinations in Croatia, that is, but overall they can usually be negative, fatalistic, and there's always a sense that the region is sort of trapped in its own past, from a Western observer point of view, and at least that's kind of common views that we will often hear. But despite this, there is still a tendency to overlook the politics and the actual history of the region. So what do we need to learn about Serbia, Bosnia and Kosovo? Joining us today is Dr. Marko Attila Hoare. Dr. Marko Attila Hoare is an associate professor and head of research for the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Sarajevo School for Science and Technology. He was born in London and received a BA honours in history from the University of Cambridge in 1984, and his PhD is in history from Yale University in 2000. He is the author of 4 published books on the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, of which Genocide and Resistance in Hitler's Bosnia, The Partisans and the Chechniks, 1941 to 1943, Oxford University Press, that's with, Oxford 2006, won the British Academy Postdoctorate Fellow Monograph competition in 2004. His work has appeared in outlets including The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Standpoint, Prospect, Open Democracy, New Lines Magazine, Left Foot Forward, and The American Conservative. He is featured in programs by the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and Sky News, Sky History Channel, and made appearances on many TV and radio stations, including BBC and Sky News. His new book is Serbia and Modern History. That was published this year, and this is going to be one of the main points of discussion for today. Marko Hoare, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed, and thank you for agreeing to talk to us. We're very, excited to have you on to talk about this very interesting area. But I wonder if we can sort of go back to the beginning, right, to the OG story, if you will. And I wonder if you can just sort of tell us, how did you sort of get interested in the former Yugoslavia to begin with?
So my mother's from Croatia and a family from Split. And every summer holiday, my family would go to Croatia on holiday, to enjoy the sea and to see relatives. So I was always felt very linked to the country. I mean, my mother was Croatian, but she also identified with the wider country of Yugoslavia. And then I was studying history as an undergraduate at Cambridge in 1991 when the war broke out. And so given the familial background and my intellectual interest while I was studying, it was impossible then not to be gripped by the history and trying to understand the historical roots of this war. Then the war in Bosnia became a real cause célèbre for many people in the West and beyond. There was a campaign against the aggression and genocide in Bosnia, but also the West's collusion in it, and this really became my kind of cause. And I went on a solidarity humanitarian aid convoy to Bosnia in the summer of 1995. Towards the end of the war. And I should say, but before that, I also felt strongly about British oppression of Ireland and the Irish question, and this also shaped my appreciation for what's happening in Bosnia, the idea of a stronger country partitioning a smaller country along ethnic lines because it wanted to become independent. So that was also a kind of a key factor for me. So yes, it's very much then about the sort of question of smaller and weaker peoples being brutally persecuted by larger ones. And that was the kind of moral, if you like, my moral starting point. But there was also this question of why is this happening? Why is such violence taking place?
Yes, indeed, indeed, and of course, this is an area which it's very interesting because it's also an area which, when we saw the sort of breakup of a lot of countries, I mean, Yugoslavia was always the more interesting one from the Eastern Bloc in a way, because when we think about it, most Central and Eastern European countries were under a sort of Soviet type system, where even if they weren't directly ruled by the Soviet Union, but clearly the Soviet Union was in charge, was, a big part of their life. I mean, even East Germany, Stasi, still had Soviet presence there. Yugoslavia was always interesting from that perspective because it became an independent communist state, partly because Tito was able to liberate the country from the Nazis before Soviets could arrive. And so it has always been a kind of independent country, and it's always had a different brand of communism. It's also been a bit more open to the West. There were holidays, people could go on holiday there even during the Cold War time. And it also had a particularly large, in political terms, armed forces and are very well equipped, which played out in the Bosnian War. And so it did pose a lot of very interesting questions, especially with the disintegration of the state. So it's a very fertile area that you've obviously chosen to think about here. Would you say that was a key reason for you?
Yes, very much this question of the kind of why something so apparently so successful would collapse like that, because Yugoslavia was seen as a successful country even by Western standards. People lived well, and the country had a high status internationally. So when Tito died in 1980, the people from all over the world, leaders in the Western, the communist world, and the Muslim world beyond, they flocked to his funeral. It was really quite a sort of an event. So how could something like that then collapse? It was took everyone by surprise. And I just felt, for me, it was a lot of the understanding was basically absent because of stereotypes. So people have their stereotypes about Yugoslavia and this kind of perfect system of socialist self-management, and how these national conflicts have been reconciled. In actual fact, a lot of things were happening which people didn't know about. So to understand why this war broke out, the long-term roots of the genocide and the breakup needed a bit more historical research.
Indeed, 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 and it's also a kind of, because I mean, I always think about that Winston Churchill quote: "Yugoslavia will last as long as Tito," which unfortunately is sort of half true. I mean, did survive 10 years after him, to be fair, but there's that sort of thing where there is a tendency as well, an opposite tendency in the West, especially, to view the Balkans generally, and especially the Yugoslavia area, overly fatalistically. Like they're always prone to these conflicts. It's always going to happen. And so I feel, doing actual research into the causes is a way of pushing back on that too, right?
Sure. Yes, and indeed. So one of the problems was this, if I call anti-Balkan racism, which I think was also very important for for the reasons why West reacted so inefficiently and incompetently to the war. So Tom Gallagher, my colleague, who's also a Balkan specialist, has written about this in his work. The fact that these stereotypes of the Balkans as inherently barbaric or primitive tribes, unworthy really of respect, has constantly derailed Western policymaking in the Balkans. So there was almost like an unwillingness to engage seriously in what this war was all about, and the rights and wrongs of it. If you just see them as kind of primitive tribes, then there's nothing you can do or should be doing. And you really want to try and get away from these stereotypes and explain these are peoples like the French or the Germans or the British, and they have to be treated with respect as a subject matter if you want to try and formulate a response to what's happening there.
And of course, you didn't just go there in the 90s. You actually were involved quite heavily in, for example, you managed to become a key part of the prosecution against Slobodan Milosevic. So how did you find yourself on a case like that to the point where you're actually in The Hague? And what was it also like to be on the front line of history in a way?
So it was a fantastic experience. I feel very privileged to have been able to have that experience. So I was finishing my PhD in the end of 1999, start of 2000, and looking for what to do next. And as someone with my specialization in the history of the region and knowing the language and so forth, I was kind of ideally placed to be recruited by them. And it turned out that several of my my mentor, Professor Ivo Banac, several of his former PhD students were already there working at the Hague in the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So I had this kind of personal connection. I could sort of contact them to find out how to get there. Once I got there, they assigned me to this case. It wasn't like I chose this case, but I'm very pleased they did assign me to it. And it was a fantastic experience of doing full-time research on a subject I was most interested in the company of other like-minded people for a good cause. I mean, subsequently, I became more disillusioned with the ICTY and its record. I felt it hadn't actually performed very well and was in many ways cynical or incompetent or never really got things right. But nevertheless, it was an amazing experience in terms of my own understanding, improving my own understanding of the war.
And did you actually, because I mean, I know with those trials at The Hague, ordinary people could actually go to a lot of the trials. I mean, I actually went to one in 2009 for one of the cases because it was in The Hague, and some guy I met outside the court just said, "Oh, if you have your passport, you can just go in and watch the trial." And it was a very interesting experience because you're sitting there at this particular one, and I think there were military commanders in the gallery, and they were having this long debate about where this area belongs. Is it meant to be part of the demilitarized zone? Who actually had control of it? And there was just this long debate. And then my feeling was there was one guy who was in the Serb military who had become a witness for the prosecution, because I remember one guy getting up and yelling at him. So there's a little melodrama as you're having this very long discussion. That's sort of my impression of the trial. Yeah. Yes. So, but did you sort of get to actually, I mean, what was it actually sort of like to see Milosevic sitting there and having to answer these charges?
Well, actually, we weren't allowed into the courtroom when he arrived because they didn't want a whole flood of these sort of, as it were, sort of, what do you call them, rubberneckers or tourists to come and flood sort of the viewing galleries. So I didn't actually get to see him in person. But it was certainly this sort of, yes, a sense of the history in the making. This is the most exciting time to be there. So I was there for 7 months during 2001, which doesn't sound like a long time, but it was incredible in terms of how much happened. So this is precisely when Milosevic arrived, and you had a sense in which now everything was going to be good, it was going to be justice, and the truth is going to be revealed. And of course, it wasn't really proper justice, but nevertheless, a lot of the truth was revealed. And the ICTY, one of the biggest things they achieved was to accumulate all this documentary evidence, and these cases, the indictments and the judgments, are an excellent source of information about the genocide, so much greater than is achieved in academia. So the point is, a lot of the academic study of the region is quite superficial. So you have these journalists and they're talking about ethnic conflicts and tribal conflicts and all this nonsense. But a lot of the academic study isn't so precise. And the ICTY, being about lawyers, you have to prove a case legally, achieves a much greater level of detail and accuracy. And you cannot afford to be talking in stereotypes and cliches, because that won't wash. So one of the best things about studying there or working there, doing research there, was the appreciation of institutions, and that's really what a lot of it was about. So not so much about nationalism, because Western academics are obsessed with nationalism, really about this national identities, national conflicts, ideologies, but this is really about structures and institutions. So you have the Yugoslav army as the main force of the aggression, and then you have the police forces. So the Republic of Serbia, it has a sort of secret police and a public police, and they're involved in stirring up the Serb rebellion in Bosnia and Croatia. And you have the Yugoslav leadership of the Federation of Yugoslavia, which is dominated by Serbia. And then you have the Republic of Serbia, Milosevic, how he controls it all. And then on the ground, you have the Bosnian Serbs and their structures, their own police force, their army, which grew out of the Yugoslav army, and their party and their militias and paramilitary forces. So trying to work out how these all go together takes the understanding of the conflict to a much higher level, really.
Indeed, and in fact, that's actually one of the reasons, the conflict lasted as long as it sort of did. You've got all these actors playing a part, but of course, it's very clear when you're there who was doing what to who. It's not as complicated because, as you sort of mentioned as well, involved the Yugoslav army, which was always historically kind of dominated by the Serbs, especially at the higher levels. And when the country began to split up, the Serbs who took over from the Yugoslav army ended up with all of this, not only the officers and the training, but also a lot of the military equipment to carry out all of this stuff. And I believe there was an arms embargo imposed on Bosnia during the war, but I don't think there was one on Serbia itself. Was there or wasn't there?
Well, it was a general arms embargo for the whole of Yugoslavia, which was then carried over to Bosnia. And some question the legality. If it imposed on Yugoslavia, should it really apply to Bosnia, which was a new country, even though it was a successor state? And the arms embargo was requested by the Yugoslav government. So essentially, the arms embargo favored the aggressor and the perpetrators against the victims. That was one of the things we campaigned against during the war, this arms embargo.
Indeed, and it's still an important area, but I feel like we're sort of going to come back to this in a way because we're going to talk about today and its legacy. But I want to sort of turn to your book, A History of Serbia, and it's kind of surprising to me in a way that this is the first real book in English that is comprehensively looking at the history of Serbia. Because usually when you find a place that does make the news and is in conflict, you do sort of see a rush of people trying to produce work on it, not just journalists, but academics. And eventually you do get more critical voices coming along that are sort of saying, well, our understanding of what's happening here and how this place works is completely wrong, effectively. It's stereotypical, it's very bad. And here it is, and then you eventually start getting better quality of work. And given how long, it was now nearly 30 years ago, or just over 30 years ago, that we had the conflict in, Bosnia, and obviously Serbia was a key part of that. It's still surprising to me that it's taking this long for there to be a comprehensive history of Serbia. What's your sort of feeling about that?
It's a very big task, and it's an absolutely huge task. And if I perhaps understood how big a task it was, I might have thought twice about embarking upon it. I mean, the point is that there's a vast literature, and most of the work on serious work on Serbian history is done by Serbian historians working in the Serbian language based in Serbia, some extent in the broader form of Yugoslavia. And to master that literature is very difficult to be respectable. So, so you can either do what I did and spend literally years doing it, which takes forever, or you can try and do a kind of half-baked thing and do it much more quickly, in which case it might be acceptable to a sort of uninformed Western audience, but won't be respectable in the eyes of Serbian historians. So it's really a very, very big task. And I think the last one was Michael Boro-Petrić's History of Modern Serbia, which was like nearly 50 years ago now that came out. And you've had several books, Histories of Serbia, more recently that have been much kind of like sketchier, more kind of like a brief overview. But it's a lot of work. It's a huge literature if you want to do it properly. And in a sense, I could have gone on forever finding more books to read and to write about. I had to say at some point, I'm just going to stop now because it's just could take my whole life, really.
Again, I feel like the question to ask here now is, what is Serbia?
So this is indeed a kind of a central question, because of course Serbia didn't exist as a country at the time my history starts. So it was a powerful state for a while in the Middle Ages, and then the Ottomans conquered it in the 15th century and wiped out Serbia's statehood. So there was no Serbia. But then you had a migration of Serbs to what is the Habsburg Empire, so later on Croatia and Vojvodina, and the sort of also to Bosnia. So Serbs migrated west across Bosnia. So you have this kind of Serb diaspora being created, and it wasn't clear to people exactly where Serbia should be. So until the start of the 19th century, the center of gravity of Serb national life was in the Habsburg Empire, what was then southern Hungary, so like Vojvodina, Croatia. And a sort of broader area around there. And then sometimes when Serbia was thought of, it was thought of as being further south to where the state ultimately appeared. So more like the historical core of medieval Serbia, which was a bit further south than when the modern state is. So essentially you're creating a new country, and it took a while for the people there to start thinking a bit in terms of Serbia, for that name to be fully accepted. So you're creating essentially a new country based upon some foundations which are pre-existing, but nevertheless, it's a new project, and it then has to create its own identity and presence.
Indeed. And so when we talk about sort of Serbia in sort of the medieval period before, or the Ottomans, and also during the Ottoman conquest, what sort of group are we talking about here? Because Are we talking about a group that's primarily sort of held together by language? Are we talking about the church? What are we talking about in terms of identity?
So this is a very, very, very good question, and it wasn't automatic. So this community was the people who spoke Serb and were of the Orthodox religion, and that was the nation that was essentially carrying out its rebellion and establishing its state, its kind of little autonomous state in the early 19th century. So Orthodox Serbs who spoke the Serb language. Muslims were excluded. Those local Muslims were not considered Serbs, they were considered like Turks. And ultimately, most of them left. And that wasn't just the Serbs wanting them out, it was also the Ottoman Empire not wanting to leave them under Serb Christian rule. Then later, the nationalists then tried to kind of go beyond this and in order to take over Bosnia, for example, which was their plan, you had to try and broaden the definition of Serbs out to include Catholics, Croats, and Muslims, Bosniaks. And that was kind of what became the formal ideology of Serbian expansionism. But it was always a tension there because they were Catholics and Muslims were never really seen as equal, and there were those who ever rejected that Muslims and Catholics could really be Serbs. So that question was there. I mean, Vuk Karadžić, who was the famous sort of linguistic reformer in a sort of the sort of period of Serbian history up until the 1860s, was believing there's sort of a linguistic definition. So those who spoke the Stockhavian dialect would be Serbs. This was kind of asserting a great Serbia and reducing Croatians to a very small territory. And that kind of opened the door to a kind of cross-religious Serb nationhood. But it didn't work in the end.
Indeed. And so when we sort of talk about the sort of modern period, so we're sort of talking about, especially because you have, of course, the uprising against the Ottomans, and then you also have it's sort of a very gradual decline of the Ottomans in a way, because certain parts of Serbia are independent, but other parts are not, and so on. And it sort of amalgamates over time. But when we're sort of talking about Serb expansionism and wanting to sort of rule different communities, how did that sort of idea of Serbness sit alongside this another idea that came along later, which was Yugoslavia?
Right. So this tension was always kind of there between the two projects. So what is the difference between Serbia and Yugoslavia? Because the Serbian plans for expansionism encompass most of what's today Yugoslavia. So apart from Slovenia and a very small part of Croatia, most of those lands were considered Serb lands. So there wasn't such a big difference between the two concepts, and there was some sort of fluidity. But ultimately, what it boiled down to, when it really became a question, are we going for Serbia or for Yugoslavia, is are you intending to expand Serbia and impose its system on these lands to the west, or do you want to immerse the Serb nation in something bigger and broader and new to try and dissolve the oppressive, as it was seen, social order or political order at home? So this difference then between Greater Serbia and Yugoslavia was in large part this difference in a more conservative Great Serbian option, and the more kind of like sort of liberal option of Yugoslavia. So it was kind of an ambiguity between these two models. So this one of the most important figures in Serbian history, Nikola Pasic, who was a leader of the main political party among Serbs in Serbia, which had most of the popular support from the 1880s up until sort of the 1920s. It was the most important political party among Serbs in Serbia. And he kind of sort of fudged this question, but fundamentally he didn't like the idea of Serbia. He became more conservative as he got older and didn't like the idea of Serbia being immersed in a Yugoslavia which would lose its identity and it wouldn't be the leading element anymore. He wanted Serbia to impose its system on lands to the west, onto the Croatians and Bosnians and Slovenes. And then a more liberal, his former supporters who broke with him partly over this question saw it differently, that Serbia was an oppressive authoritarian regime, that this radical party was oppressive and corrupt, the monarchy was oppressive and corrupt. So you have to try and overthrow this order partly by immersing it in a Yugoslav whole to create something new. But this tension then remained throughout, and of course then later on, King Alexander, who was the dictator, the dictatorial king of Yugoslavia, then it kind of took over the idea of Yugoslavia to establish his own dictatorship. So these ideas could then be kind of change meaning over time.
Indeed, and we're going to come back also to Serbia under Yugoslavia, because this is an interesting question. But before we sort of get there, I want to sort of get a sense of the ordinary Serb during these times. I mean, we talk a lot about nationalism and national movements. Often it starts off in the elite areas of society, and we tend to tell history when we think about nationalism from the elite point of view. For the ordinary person living in Serbia, who's, today maybe identified as a Serb, what is their relationship to the question of Serbia? Would they see themselves or understand themselves, if we're sort of in the middle of the 19th century, as Serbs? Would they, what about, in terms of their daily life, their identity? What about, their language? Is it standardized enough? What is it? What is their relationship to the question?
I mean, this is really one of the central questions of the book. Precisely this question, to which there is, it's a big answer. Essentially, the Serbs were mostly peasant people, so they didn't have much in the way of elite at the time when the story starts in the early 19th century. So in the process of liberating themselves from the Ottomans, they kind of created this new elite, which partly grew out of these kind of headmen that had existed, or local leaders that existed under the Ottomans, were kind of communal leaders who the Ottomans had recognized. And Miloš Obrenović, who was the first prince of Serbia, and he kind of was the real founder of modern Serbia, and he kind of created this new, built this new elite. But he was also a collaborator, so very quickly he collaborated with the Ottomans rather than resisting. So he essentially had this autonomous Serbia run by Miloš and his new elite, which was running the new Serbia on behalf of the Ottomans and keeping it quiet while quietly building itself up as a state. And for the ordinary peasants, it didn't seem there was much of a liberation. So this new Serbia continued to collect the same oppressive taxes, in some ways worse. It was still ruled by officials who were just as venal and oppressive, abusive, if not worse, than the Ottomans had been. So for many people, it didn't seem really like liberation very much. So what you then had was this new populist backlash against the new state, the second wave, if you like, of resistance, which then treated the new Serbia as essentially a continuation of Ottoman oppression, and directed its nationalism against the elite. And as the elite so it built an army and a bureaucracy and a school system and levied heavy taxes on the peasantry and inflicted corporal punishment. So it's modernizing but oppressive. And this elite emulated mainstream Euro-Christian European dress from Central and Western Europe, Western style or Central European style dress and manners, became Westernized, if you like, or Europeanized or modernized. You can use different terms, but for many Serbs, the elite seemed alien. So this became a central part of populist nationalism, the tendency to view your own elite as the enemy, as alien, and direct your nationalism against it. And it also explains why Serbs often don't feel very happy with their state. They have maybe an idealized view of the better, greater Serbia, but the actual state that exists with its police and tax collectors is not really seen as something you can really identify with. So there's this kind of strange phenomenon of anti-state nationalism directed against your own state and leadership. And that's been kind of present up until the present day.
Well, that'd be an interesting thing to explore when we sort of come to it. But I'm also sort of wondering here, because also during the 18th and specifically 19th century, this is the era of nationalism. This is also the era where, you're starting to see more written in the West about what's happening in the Balkans. They're taking more of an interest, and I always think it's kind of interesting because there's always, as I sort of said in the intro, there's a sort of tendency to view it as fatalistic. And I sort of wonder I was the other day I sort of encountered this video which talked about what happened when the Austrian army entered, I think it was in the 18th century, entered parts of Serbia for the first time, and then it was to do with the so-called vampire killings in Serbia, and that sort of sense that this place is kind of superstitious and weird. And I sort of wonder, that sort of was that basically because this is obviously what the Austrians themselves are writing, and this is a period of the Enlightenment. So I sort of wonder, is this the sort of period where we start to see that sort of prejudice about Serbs and people who live in that region as being fatalistic, backwards, that kind of thing? Is that something we sort of start to see around this period?
Well, certainly there was no doubt about it that the Serb population in what became Serbia was, in a sense, was very underdeveloped and uneducated. So there were not proper schools, and people were mostly illiterate, and all these kind of peasant superstitions about vampires and witches and ghosts and the like. And sort of open the sort of windows when the house is when someone dies, so that the spirit can escape and so forth. There was some sense it was natural you to have outsiders looking down on these on the people there. My feeling is that yes, there was a sense in which the Austrians viewed this as a kind of civilizing mission or a kind of colonial terms, and that certainly became present very much when they occupied Bosnia. They kind of really more, saw themselves doing something which the French were doing in Tunisia or the British in India, as sort of ruling over a sort of lower people, if you like. I think that the real anti-Balkan prejudice perhaps got going in a sort of the Balkans stereotype a bit later, because it's not just about viewing the Balkans as primitive, but also viewing them as kind of arrivist. So the Balkans, they create their new states, but they don't ever seem quite right. They seem a bit more kind of like rough around the edges. The elites seem a bit more primitive. So they don't really seem as good as we Central Western Europeans. So some of the events, like for example, this the murder of the King and Queen of Serbia in 1903, very brutal murder, which I go into in quite a lot of detail in my book, was horrific and helped to kind of reinforce negative stereotypes about the Balkans. And then, of course, this also was involved when you had several states competing with each other and fighting over what seemed to the bigger countries as being petty reasons, to say Serbs fighting Bulgarians, and then later on the Bulgarians fighting the Greeks and so on and so forth, that this was seen as being kind of these petty little people with their petty little conflicts. So I think the Balkan prejudices, if you like, they sort of began with a perception of primitivism, but it became much more, if you like, more than just about looking down on those seen as primitive.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you're referring to the murder of the royal family is quite an interesting one. Weren't they also like thrown from open rooftops when they were being murdered? And wasn't there like a famous description? Because I know that it was sort of these sorts of details were being shared quite widely in the Western press at that time, and it sort of formed an image of these very like violent, barbaric people. They don't just kill royalty; look at how they kill them.
Sure, exactly. I mean, so it was really like almost like a kind of honor killing. So this Queen of Serbia, Draga, she was, you might say, a modern woman, a trailblazing modern woman. She was educated. She'd worked as an editor. And she read literature, and she'd had past sexual relations, which today is absolutely normal. But then it was kind of seemed shocking that the woman who's queen has had previous relations. They were greatly exaggerated by the misogyny, and she was older than him, and she was correctly suspected of not being able to have children. So there was a kind of misogynistic reaction against her. How dare this? And she was portrayed as a sort of prostitute and everything. It's just how dare this lowly woman, become queen? And this helped to discredit the monarchy. So you can see that murder in some ways as a kind of backlash against female emancipation. No, that wasn't the main reason, but that was an element. So, for example, one of the people who's part of that clique, which eventually murdered her, was complaining that that this queen read these kind of modern literature, which talked about free women, which was outrageous. Actually, she should read this literature. So it was an honor killing. So she was seen as dishonoring the king, and the king was seen as having dishonored himself and his monarchy by marrying her, and that then created the kind of part of the emotional motivation for killing them, although of course it was much more complicated reasons for why that happened.
Indeed. And so why do you think it happened? You obviously you outline it in the book, but could you give us a brief sort of summary of why it happened?
So there was the peculiarity of Serbian dynastic politics in this period. I mean, normally the dynasty rests upon, well, the dynastic regime rests upon the dynasty and the individuals, kings and princes. So you had this very erratic, I would say, sort of borderline sociopathic previous king, Milan, who was he abdicated in 1889 and then left his infant son Alexander as the next king, but obviously he was too young to be king, so he had to have a regency. But then Milan came back and interfered in politics, and this kind of split the Serbian dynastic regime between two factions. I mean, Milan was initially working with Alexander, but a lot of the people tended to view him as a real head of a dynasty, the Obrenović dynasty. And he represented the hardline faction, like say the far right or hard right faction, which didn't want to accommodate the radical party, which I mentioned earlier, and had most of the popular support. Alexander was more flexible, but when he then wanted to marry this woman, Draga Masin, with whom he was very much in love, and it was one of the rare kind of genuine love stories of this period. Most of his dynastic marriages were very unhappy. Then his father and his father's hardline quite far right faction split with him. So it's kind of a fissured cut in the regime. And then when Milan died, they then, because they've been marginalized now, and they set out to murder Alexander to try and, to compensate for their loss of position and authority. And Alexander, meanwhile, was slightly more liberal version. He wanted to accommodate the radicals and build a slightly more, not genuine democracy, but a more liberal power sharing agreement with the radicals would be involved in government. So it was like, you call it really a Praetorian backlash, particularly among army officers, members of the old elite, against any attempt to share power with the radicals, and also to kind of like to sort of compensate for the fact that they'd been driven out of power. And it kind of created the Frankenstein's monster, its Praetorianism, its tendency of the army to interfere with politics. And then after Alexander was killed, and you had a new regime coming, a supposedly democratic regime, this Praetorian faction continued to meddle in politics and was responsible for dragging Serbia into the First World War and then eventually into the Second World War as well. So it was kind of a Frankenstein's monster that took a very high toll in blood before it was eventually destroyed in the Second World War.
Well, that's a very nice, interesting summary. And I want to return to the question of Serbian and Serbianness under Yugoslavia. What happened to the idea of Serbia and Serbians whilst Yugoslavia's around? Obviously, you have the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, then you have obviously the communist regime, but then it sort of re-emerges as a force, especially in the 90s. At least it comes out into the open. So tell us about that. How, what happened during this period and how did it sort of become an open force again?
Right. So as I say, there was kind of that ambiguity of the boundary between Serbia and Yugoslavia. So for perhaps the mainstream position in Serbia was that Yugoslavia was simply a larger, it was like it wasn't really distinct from Serbia, so that the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes were the only three people accepted as existing, and they were really tribes of a larger, broader nation, which could be called Yugoslav. So all the other peoples, like Muslim Bosniaks and Macedonians and Montenegrins and so forth, they were all really Serbs. And insofar as like there were people in Macedonia who didn't feel Serb, they're really just a Bulgarian minority who need to be assimilated. And they thought most of Croat lands were anyway Serbs, and most Croats were really Serbs, and the real Croats were a tiny group around Zagreb and the capital in the north of that. But obviously this proved difficult to sustain once you had Yugoslavia established on the basis of Serbian leadership, and non-Serbs continued to kind of resist and demand their autonomy. So the more enlightened ones had always seen Yugoslavia as a community in which Serbs were just one element and Serbia was just one land and shouldn't be imposing itself on the rest. And they moved towards acceptance of some kind of federal arrangement. And then in the Second World War, you had this revolution led by Tito and the partisans, which established this federal Yugoslavia. And that really cut Serbia down to size. And in principle, they were kind of, you were made to accept that Serbia was just one republic and the Serbs outside, but Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia, they were Montenegro, separate republics. The Montenegrins were a separate nation, and the Serbs were not the leading element, nor was Yugoslavia an extension of themselves. Again, as long as Yugoslavia was a kind of centralized state under the communist dictatorship, the Serb nationalists could accept this. But the more decentralized and federalized it came, the more Bosnian became generally independent, or at least autonomous. Then it was you had a Serb nationalist backlash that Milosevic ultimately led. So they were not prepared to accept Serb nationalists. They were not prepared to accept a Yugoslavia of equals in which Serbia was just one constituent element, and not the kind of the leading one. I should also say that even when Yugoslavia was centralized in the period my book covers, so King Alexander was the dictator he was the king who established a dictatorship in 1929 and tried to kind of unify Yugoslavia into a single nation state in which there would be no national differences between any of its peoples. That was the most ambitious attempt to kind of create a Yugoslav nation. And the Serbs themselves didn't like that. They felt it was diffused their national identity and weakened them. So they said, well, under Yugoslavia, the Croats are uniting behind their national movement. The Bosnian Muslims will vote for one party, the Slovenes will vote for one party, but we Serbs are divided. And this kind of belief in trying to sacrifice ourselves for Yugoslavia is hurting us. So we need to have a more Serbia-oriented strategy. So that's part of the reason why Yugoslavia entered the Second World War, was that the regime was seen as being too Yugoslav, insufficiently Serb, and not defending Serb national interests. And you had a Serb nationalist backlash that took shape in his coup d'etat in 1941, which then dragged Yugoslavia into the Second World War. And there's this question of this difficulty of trying to reconcile the concepts of Serbia and Serbdom with Yugoslavia and Yugoslavism, and the Serb nationalists never really properly were able to reconcile the two, or to try and create a kind of coherent vision of what that meant, that relationship.
Indeed. And so in terms of what happened in the 90s specifically, I mean, how did we sort of get to, as we sort of mentioned, we had Tito in charge, then he dies, and then in the 1980s, Yugoslavia sort of survives on for 10 years. And then in the 1990s, we finally have the referendums, which is at the end of the life for Yugoslavia. And then we have the brutal wars. What sort of happens here? How do these institutions break down into all of this?
So on paper, the system was very enlightened and provided guarantees for everyone, but that only really worked when you had this kind of strong regime under Tito that was prepared to kind of hold the balance. And once Tito was gone, and once central authority in Yugoslavia wasn't really didn't enjoy the same authority, then it was possible for Serb nationalists to subvert it using these existing institutions. So, for example, the Yugoslav army, in principle, for historic reasons, that the majority of the officer corps was Serb, and the Serbs also had that absolute majority in the officer corps, but the top leadership was supposed to reflect the balance between the republics. But because, for example, the defense minister was the top commander of the Yugoslav army, and he was from Croatia, and he was half Serb and half Croat since the start of the 1990s, but he was essentially a Serb nationalist, and he came in Milosevic's ally, Veljko Kadijevic. And then the chief of staff, who was sort of the second figure, was a Serb from Bosnia, and he also was a Serb from Bosnia. He was supposed to represent Bosnia, but of course he then fell in behind a Serb nationalist campaign as well. So the fact that you had Serbs from Croatia and Bosnia kind of representing their republics kind of meant that they could swing the other way and help deliver the army to Serb nationalism. These kind of autonomous provinces in Serbia, Kosovo and Vojvodina, had become virtual republics by the time Tito died. Most of the attributes of a republic, but because they were formerly part of Serbia, it then became possible for Serbia to try and reclaim them, which it did by bending the federal institutions. 1988, 1989, Milosevic is in Serbia, which controlled, of course, the capital city of Yugoslavia, could able to put pressure, partly through the use of crowds and the threat of violence, to force the federal authorities to authorize the suppression of the Kosovo Albanians by the army. So this federation didn't really work because the federation was too much open to the federal central organs, were too much open to abuse and coercion by Serbia as the central state. So essentially, once you had the two autonomous provinces suppressed, then and Montenegro was taken over. Montenegro's population is a large part of it identifies as Serbs and looks to Serbia, and that was easy to take over as well. And Milosevic then had, of 8 federal members in the presidency, he had 4. So he had the federal presidency had Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Vojvodina, which were all controlled by Serbia, and that gave him a sort of hegemonic position in that body as well. So Serbia essentially bent these Titoist institutions to co-opt them for its own great Serbian plans.
So before I sort of get on to the next question, I sort of want to pose this question at you, which is to do with these institutions and its ability to do this. To your mind, is this a sign of institutional weakness, that certain groups can get into the institutions, and institutions are too weak to sort of prevent them from doing the damage? Because in theory, when you have strong institutions, one of the things they do is act as barriers on the people who hold power in those institutions. Or is it a sign of strength that it can actually still it can implement all of these things across the country? So where do you sort of sit on that? Do you see it as a story of institutional strength or weakness?
Well, I would say a weakness in terms of the intended norms So this system was intended by Tito and his communist regime genuinely to hold some kind of balance between the nationalities. So it was generally intended to prevent domination by the Serbs or by anyone else. And as time went by, they emancipated the Kosovo Albanians increasingly. The Kosovo Albanians were treated like essentially a colony in the earlier Titoist years and very brutally repressed. But towards the end of his regime, they'd largely been emancipated and had their own autonomous province. So you had these norms and this intent, what the intention was behind this system, but there were not enough institutional safeguards to prevent Serb nationalists co-opting these institutions for their own purpose. And the fact is, most people are at some level nationalists. So you had these mainstream people like Milosevic himself had been the kind of secretary of the Serbian Communist organization. He was not a nationalist by background, but he became a nationalist very quickly. It's something which is very easy to do. And then there were not enough institutional safeguards to prevent his abuse of power. And he had that support of influential generals in the Yugoslav People's Army and older communists themselves who were kind of inclined towards nationalism. And of course, they didn't necessarily know where their politics were taking them. It wasn't necessarily all planned in advance, but you start going down a certain road, and it's hard to necessarily to sort of pull back from that. I think the large problem is that these were not democracies. I mean, we saw when Trump attacked the Capitol, he didn't want to accept his election. The American institutions are very strong in preventing that. So no matter how much Trump wanted to carry out a coup d'etat and overturn the election results, he wasn't in a position to do that. But this was a country with much kind of like weaker liberal norms, much less democratic oversight, a much stronger police, and much more state-controlled media. And those institutional safeguards simply didn't exist. So in a sense, these institutions like the Yugoslav army were supposed to be an institution to safeguard brotherhood and unity and the rights of all the peoples, and it became a tool of great Serbian aggression, the principal tool of the genocide. So it's a great tragedy because it wasn't what the system was intended to be.
So, what sort of historical trends, obviously now you've written this book, do you see playing out in Serbia as well as Bosnia and the other places where we find Serbs living? What sort of themes from Serb history do we see playing out today?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can see a lot of these patterns recurring. So, I mean, I mentioned Nikola Pasic and his Radical Party, in the 1880s, and they initially were quite radical, and they wanted to overthrow what they saw as a decadent order in Serbia, the monarchical, so the old elite, and because it was not nationalist, it was treasonous, it collaborated with Austria-Hungary, it was un-Serb, and Milosevic really kind of revived that ideology and that strategy 100 years later, kind of the early radical ideology. So he saw the previous Serbian communist regime and Yugoslav regime as being un-Serb or anti-Serb, not protecting Serbian national interests, and built a kind of popular movement to overturn them. And well, I guess one of the messages in my book, insofar as it's not obviously a political book, but when I was thinking what message do you have that's convey politically, is the importance of pluralism, the fact that Serbs were not able to kind of mediate these different differences, that nationalists said you have to enforce national unity, unite everyone behind a single party or a single regime. And the actual effect was the opposite. It actually created massive discord and disunity and collapse as the opposition was driven into extreme places. And of course, Milosevic also tried to do that. He tried to enforce national unity behind himself and his regime. And Alexander Vučić today is doing the same thing. So the idea is that there's just one authentic voice of the nation, and those who do not subscribe to its program or do not accept its authority are un-Serb or traitors, essentially. So Serbia still hasn't really come to the point where it can really accept real pluralism and have that sort of expressed in party politics, with the different parties competing fairly for elections. It seemed like Serbia was evolving towards democracy for a while, but now it's reverted to a more authoritarian path. And part of this is also to pursue irredentist goals. So we know that, for example, a country to achieve peace, it has to stop with irredentism. So Germany's success today is Germany is a tremendously successful country since the Second World War, because it's turned its back on trying to expand its borders. No longer wants to annex Austria or the Sudetenland or whatever it might be. And Serbia hasn't achieved that realization. So it's still pursuing these irredentist goals. So they're still waiting for the time when they can restore Serbian control over Kosovo and perhaps regain Montenegro and at least part of Bosnia, the Republika Srpska. The dynamic among Bosnian Serbs is slightly different because they were a community within Bosnia rather than an independent state. And until Yugoslavia was established in 1918, Bosnian Serbs viewed the whole of Bosnia as a Serb land. And formally, at least, they viewed the Bosnian Muslims as Serbs, and to some extent the Croats as well, the Catholics as being Serbs, just different religions. And then since then, since they unable to absorb Bosnia even within Yugoslavia, then moved towards partition. And then this Republika Srpska, established through the genocide, is an entirely new entity. So it has precedents in the Chetnik politics of the 1940s, and before that, the plans to partition Bosnia. So King Alexander partitioned Bosnia in 1929, partly on the advice of his justice minister, who was a leading Bosnian Serb, a politician. So that's kind of a new place in the sense what the Bosnian Serbs are doing. They've created this entity through this genocide and a partition, and they wanted that to achieve independence. I mean, overall, it's the same pursuit of expansionism and Greater Serbia, but of course, it takes different forms in different generations.
Where do you sort of sense Serbian society, if you're thinking about the Republic of Serbia, rather than Republika Srpska, where do you sort of see them in relation to all of this? Because, of course, as you sort of mentioned, we had Milosevic, but he was also toppled by, popular crowds in Serbia. And so, if you're in Belgrade, what do people there, what's the direction they're moving in? What's the sort of feeling on the street about all of this?
I mean, that revolution overthrowing Milosevic. I was actually living there not on the day of Parliament was stormed, but I was there the day after when Milosevic announced his resignation. So I got a bit of a feeling of the kind of the vibe there. Essentially, this was a regime which was very heavily discredited, and most people one spoke to were disillusioned with the regime. But the actual process of how to actually bring about its overthrow wasn't very straightforward, given its control of the police, the organs of repression. And what took place in 2000, in October 2000, was essentially a combination of a popular revolution with a kind of elite putsch, in which you had elements of the regime abandoning it. So ultimately, Milosevic couldn't get the troops or police to sort of use violence against the crowds. His own regime was abandoned by most of its key leaders. After losing the war with NATO and losing Kosovo, that was really decisive in terms of how discredited it was. The United States also providing its assistance in bringing these forces together. But then the person who came after him, this kind of compromise candidate, Vojislav Koštunica, was in many ways a continuity candidate. So he wasn't personally compromised by involvement in war crimes, but nevertheless, he was the hardline nationalist voice who wanted to protect these institutions that had been involved in war crimes. So the voice of the same establishment that had been kind of engaged in the aggression and genocide. So it was kind of like, in some ways, it was a real revolution. Serbia hasn't really had any wars since then, but another level, it was a kind of a putsch and a false revolution. And I believe that since then, you've had a lot of disillusion among ordinary people about reform politics. So Zoran Đinđić, the real voice of reform in Serbia, the one who really wanted to liberalize Serbia and turn it towards the West, was assassinated by members of the Red Berets, the sort of special forces of Milosevic, which have been involved in war crimes. And then gradually Serbia has declined. And you can see that partly in terms of a response to wider conditions beyond Serbia. So this rise of authoritarian right-wing populism, you can see it in terms of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Netanyahu in Israel and Erdogan in Turkey and Trump in America, these kind of figures, authoritarian populist regimes linked to kind of right-wing populism everywhere, and Brexit campaign in Britain. So it's part of a trend that makes it easier for authoritarian nationalists like Vučić in Serbia to kind of pursue their politics. So my feeling is that people in Serbia they're disillusioned with politics generally, but they remain very nationalist. So, you could be against Milosevic, and even if you want your country to liberalize and join the West, doesn't mean you're not a nationalist anymore. And I think nationalism has never gone away, and it's a very easy stick to sort of, to wield against opponents. The Serbian population remains still committed to that nationalist paradigm. There hasn't been any successful attempt to re-educate them in any way. But I wouldn't say that means that its great popularity or desire for war. It just means it's kind of instinctive nationalism which ordinary people feel.
Interesting. And where do you see sort of Kosovo at the minute? Because of course, a few weeks ago we had election in Kosovo, but there's always been this issue with Kosovo trying to sort of secede and become its own country, which obviously Serbia doesn't accept. And there's always this feeling that tension will boil over into something more serious. So what do you sort of see as the dynamics there? And could you actually also explain, why is Kosovo so keen on, succession? I mean, obviously we've mentioned earlier about the suppression and genocide against Albanians there in the 1990s, but I wonder if we can talk a bit more about that.
Sure. So Kosovo had been part of medieval Serbia for a couple of hundred years, but the medieval borders shift and they don't really necessarily mean much for determining modern history. So in modern times, Serbia conquered Kosovo in the Balkan Wars in 1912, and there was already an Albanian majority there, which was subjected to extreme brutality, something perhaps approaching genocide by the Serbian conquering armies. So it was essentially a colony, and Albanians were viewed in very racist terms by Serb intellectuals that justified this conquest. And so then it was kind of treated as a colony and subject to kind of forced assimilation and kept uneducated by the regime in Belgrade in the interwar period, and to some extent in the post-war period as well. So it's given a status of autonomy after at the end of the Second World War by the victorious communists, but essentially still treated essentially as a Serbian colony ruled by police brutality. And then as the regime liberalized from the mid-60s or so, the Yugoslav regime began to wake up and to kind of emancipate Kosovo, increasingly to give it its autonomy. So it was like almost like it became a separate republic in everything but name, but still formally part of Serbia. So for the Albanians there, they never identified with Serbia. They always viewed Serbia as the colonizer, the oppressor, and they wanted their own republic. And if they'd been given that republic, they might have been accepted Yugoslavia and membership of it. But they were never prepared to be ruled by Serbia. And then Milosevic took power by mobilizing over the Kosovo issue to restore Serbian control over this territory. So there really isn't much kind of a basis for any real compromise anymore. And of course, you had the uprising in the 90s by the Kosovo Liberation Army, and then essentially what was attempted genocide by Serbia against the population there. So for their point of view, it's like you're being colonized by this oppressor, whether it's like the Irish and the British or the Palestinians, and the Israelis, you don't want to be ruled by this alien oppressive state, which has subject your people to genocide and views them as inferior. It's not like the Bosnian Serbs and Muslims who have this kind of, and Croats who have this kind of history of shared identity and a lot of sort of almost like a sense of equality between them. Historically, they've spoken the same language and had this shared history living together for centuries. This really was not the case in Kosovo with Serbia, with the Serbs and Albanians. So it really is, that essentially that ship has sailed. There's no real way the Albanians will ever really consent to be under Serbian rule again. So for Serbia to try and restore its control of that territory could only really be done by massive repression, probably genocide, ethnic cleansing. You'd have to essentially drive out the population to make it possible, which is what Milosevic tried to do at the end of the 90s. I sort of feel that these European history is the history of new states appearing, new independent states, like Finland, which didn't really exist in any real shape or form much more than a couple of hundred years ago, but now is a fully independent state. Or Norway seceded from Sweden at the start of the 20th century, and Ireland seceded from the United Kingdom, and Poland then appeared, having disappeared from the map of Europe. So we have to accept that new states appear in Europe periodically, and I'm sure there'll be more states in the future. This won't be the last one. Whether Catalonia, for example, may one day, or Scotland may one day become an independent state.
Interesting. And before we sort of get to the very last question, how is the sort of Kosovo issue viewed by Bosnians?
Mm-hmm. So not as straightforwardly as you might imagine. So the Bosniaks have not always been very sympathetic to the Albanians in Kosovo. So part of the reason is that the Bosniaks were the most enthusiastic Yugoslavs, and they really identified with their system, whereas the Albanians in Kosovo were the least enthusiastic and the ones who most felt this was an alien, oppressive state. And so some of the Bosniak officials were involved in the repression of Kosovo Albanians, and so they tended, up until the war started, they tended to sympathise more with the Serbs over the issue, and then since then there wasn't much solidarity between either nation during the repression. They tended not to be showing any real solidarity. Ironically, despite the religious, the fact they're all Muslims didn't change that, and actually the Albanians tend to get on better with the Croats, partly because they share this kind of genuine animosity to Yugoslavia and to Belgrade in a different way. So actually, that's not ironic. That religious difference didn't really apply, and many Albanians found careers in the Croatian army. But then more recently, the Bosniaks have often been afraid that if Kosovo was allowed to secede, it would create a precedent for Republika Srpska seceding. So most of us would say there's not much similarity between them. Between Kosovo, which was a legitimate entity in Tito's federation, and Republika Srpska, which was created by genocide. But at some very abstract level, you could say that if Kosovo secedes from Serbia, then why can't Republika Srpska secede from Bosnia? So some Bosniaks felt there was that danger. I think generally more recently, as this is so shown to be not untrue, that danger, and there tended to be more solidarity between the two peoples in the face of the common enemy, because ultimately great Serbian nationalism threatens both Bosniaks and Kosovo Albanians. So they are aware they're facing the same enemy, and if it destroys one, it may destroy the next one afterwards.
So the future of it might be quite different to where the past was.
Yes, they are perhaps have more common interests today, and clearly can clearly view these common interests much more than was the case in previous generations.
Indeed. And so the last question I want to ask is, what do you see as the future of Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo?
So it's slightly difficult to be very optimistic at this precise moment in time when so Western liberal democratic norms seem to be somewhat in retreat. So what you've seen under the Biden administration is a turn towards the kind of realist appeasement of Serbia that was a characteristic of Clinton and the first George Bush, where Serbia is kind of appeased as the regional strongman. So you actually had the West supporting Vučić and Serbia against Albin Kurti's Kosovo in the dispute over the northern municipalities in Kosovo, so she's siding against Kosovo. The danger really is one thing of a Western collapse, which could be more likely if Putin wins the war in Ukraine or if Trump becomes president again. A collapse of Western authority in the Western Balkans, and Serbia would then use that to try and regain Kosovo and partition Bosnia, annex Republika Srpska. And I think many Serb nationalists are looking to that day. They've just been trying to be patient and wait for the chance for that to happen. So the other danger, though, is the maintenance of the status quo, which ultimately could lead these countries to be kept in this kind of limbo indefinitely. So the West upholds this Dayton system that prevents Bosnia from functioning as a state, prevents any real democracy happening there, keeps Bosnia under what's essentially colonial rule, and offers no chance of any reform. So there's no way you can reform that system, unless it's some ways the rules are broken. That system cannot be reformed, either democratically or consensually. There's no way that the Serb and Croat nationalists in Bosnia will ever agree to reform Bosnia to make the state functional. So much as the danger is of a breakdown of the system and a collapse, there's also a danger of a status quo remaining. Kosovo is a slightly better situation in the sense that they are much more free of the oppressor. Their constitutional system isn't so shackled, doesn't shackle them so much. And they have much more kind of united, clear-headed national leadership, which can perhaps work towards the full emancipation of their country eventually. I'd always remain hopeful for Serbia that it's a country with a lot of potential, and that eventually it will reform along more liberal, democratic, pluralistic lines and become a sort of country like other West European countries. But of course, these times are not so favorable to such model when you have this kind of populist right-wing nationalism spreading across the continent. So we hope for better times. And I think a lot depends upon what the outcome of this war in Ukraine is. Because if Putin is victorious, it'll make things much worse in the Balkans. If he's defeated, it may offer hope for reform in the Balkans as well.
Marko Hoare, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been an honor.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.